People always say betrayal comes from the people you trust the most. I used to think that was just something bitter people said after making bad choices. I was wrong. My name is Ethan Carter, and 5 years ago I believed I had everything a man could ever want. A beautiful wife, a successful family business, parents who loved me, a future that seemed untouchable. Then one signature on a divorce paper destroyed the life I thought I knew and saved me from a conspiracy that had been growing inside my father's company for nearly a decade. Not by strangers, not by competitors, but by my own mother-in-law. 36 people, 36 employees secretly working inside my father's company. Every one of them loyal to her, not to us. If someone had told me that on my wedding day, I would have laughed in their face. Because back then, I trusted Margaret. Everyone did. My father, Richard Carter, built Carter Industrial Systems from nothing. When I say nothing, I mean absolutely nothing. He grew up in a trailer outside Tulsa, Oklahoma. At 16, he dropped out of school to help support his younger sisters. At 22, he bought one broken welding machine and rented a tiny garage. He worked 18-hour days. Sometimes he slept on the concrete floor because he couldn't afford gas to drive home. Mom used to tell me stories about bringing him sandwiches while he welded steel beams, late into the night. By the time I was born, that tiny garage had become one of the largest industrial equipment manufacturers in the Midwest. Dad never acted rich. He still drove pickup trucks, still packed his own lunch, still walked the factory floor every morning shaking hands with employees. People didn't just work for him. They respected him. They loved him. He knew birthdays, kids' names, anniversaries. When someone's wife got cancer, Dad quietly paid their medical bills. No press releases. No publicity. Just kindness. That's who he was. I wasn't handed the company. Dad made sure of that. I spent summers cleaning bathrooms, loading trucks, working assembly lines, sweeping warehouses. Only after college did he finally give me a desk. He always said, "If the janitor doesn't respect you, you don't deserve the CEO's office." I believed every lesson he taught me. Integrity, loyalty, hard work. Maybe that's why I never saw betrayal coming. Then I met Olivia. She walked into a charity fundraiser wearing a simple blue dress. No expensive jewelry. No designer handbag. She smiled more than she talked. She laughed at my terrible jokes. She volunteered every weekend at an animal shelter. At least, that's what she said. Looking back, I wonder how much of that was real. 3 months later, she introduced me to her mother, Margaret Whitmore. Elegant, confident, always perfectly dressed. She had a warm smile that instantly made people comfortable. She hugged me like she'd known me forever. "Ethan," she said, "I've prayed my daughter would find a man exactly like you." My heart melted. Dad liked her immediately. Mom called her charming. Even our family lawyer complimented how intelligent she seemed. Margaret never pushed herself into conversations. She simply listened, remembered details, made everyone feel important. She was the kind of woman people naturally trusted. Now I know. That was her greatest weapon. The wedding was beautiful. 500 guests. My father cried during his speech. Mom danced barefoot by the end of the night. Margaret stood beside Olivia with tears in her eyes. She looked like the proudest mother in America. If someone had taken a picture of us that evening, you'd think we were the happiest family alive. Maybe we were. Or maybe only one family was happy. After the honeymoon, Olivia suggested something. "My mom is looking for work." Dad smiled. "Tell her to send her resume." Within a week, Margaret became Director of Community Relations. It sounded harmless. She organized charity events, handled local partnerships, employee appreciation programs. No financial authority, no executive power, just public relations. Dad said she brought warmth to the company. Employees adored her. She remembered birthdays, visited sick workers, organized holiday parties. She baked cookies for factory staff. Everyone called her Mama Margaret. Even I did, a few months later. Margaret recommended someone for human resources. "She's wonderful," Margaret insisted. Dad trusted her. He approved the hire. Then another recommendation. Then another. Accounting, purchasing, scheduling, maintenance, customer service. Always qualified. Always impressive interviews. Always someone Margaret just happened to know. Nobody questioned it. Neither did I. Why would we? The company had over 800 employees. Adding a few recommendations every year seemed normal. Even healthy. Dad always believed good people knew other good people. 5 years passed. Business exploded. Revenue nearly doubled. We opened 2 new facilities. Everyone celebrated. Margaret became almost part of the executive family. She sat beside Dad during charity galas, hosted Christmas dinners, even helped plan my parents' anniversary celebration. Mom loved having another woman to share responsibilities with. Olivia always said, "See, Mom finally has the family she never had." I believed her. Every word. Then something strange started happening. Nothing dramatic. Just odd. Departments stopped communicating. Suppliers changed without explanation. Contracts disappeared from shared drives. Managers I'd trusted for years suddenly resigned. When I asked questions, nobody seemed to know anything. Dad blamed rapid growth. Our systems just need updating. Maybe. But my instincts told me something else. One Friday evening, I stayed late reviewing payroll. A number caught my attention. One division had hired 9 people within 6 months. I didn't recognize a single name. Strange. That department wasn't even expanding. When I asked HR on Monday, they had perfectly reasonable explanations. Temporary staffing, special projects, seasonal contracts. Everything looked legitimate. Still, something felt wrong. At home, I mentioned it to Olivia. She barely looked up from her phone. You worry too much. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. But then, she asked something unusual. Are your parents changing their wills anytime soon? I looked at her. What? She laughed awkwardly. I was just curious. I told myself it was an innocent question. I wanted to believe that. Love has a funny way of making intelligent people ignore obvious warning signs. 3 months later, I discovered Olivia had been secretly meeting with Margaret every Wednesday morning. Not unusual. Mother and daughter are close. Except, neither of them ever told me. And whenever I asked where she'd been, the answers never matched. Lunch with friends, shopping, yoga, volunteer work, small lies, tiny lies, the kind that seem meaningless. Until they aren't. The night everything truly changed. Dad called me into his office after everyone had gone home. He looked exhausted, older than I'd ever seen him. Without saying a word, he slid a folder across his desk. Inside was a report from an outside auditor. One sentence was highlighted in yellow. Evidence suggests coordinated internal hiring patterns connected to a single external source. Dad looked me in the eyes. Ethan, I think someone inside our family is stealing this company. And at that moment, neither of us had any idea how horrifying the truth would become. Dad's words echoed in my head long after I left his office. I think someone inside our family is stealing this company. The sentence sounded impossible. Our competitors had tried to beat us for years. We'd survived lawsuits, supply shortages, recessions, and even a factory fire. But betrayal from inside our own family? That was something I couldn't imagine. I drove home in complete silence. When I walked through the front door, Olivia was sitting on the couch watching television. She smiled. You're late. Normally, I'd kiss her forehead before answering. That night, I simply nodded. Dad needed help with some paperwork. She studied my face for a second. You look stressed. I'm just tired. She stood up and wrapped her arms around me. For a brief moment, I wanted to believe everything was still normal. But then I caught the faint scent of Margaret's expensive perfume on Olivia's jacket. She had been with her mother again. She never mentioned it. Neither did I. The next morning, Dad introduced me to the outside auditor who had written the report. His name was Daniel Brooks, a quiet man in his early 60s who had spent 35 years investigating corporate fraud. He wasn't interested in theories, only facts. He placed several folders on the conference table. Ethan, he said calmly, Someone has been building influence inside this company for years. He opened the first folder. Every employee hired through Margaret's recommendation was listed. I counted them. 36. Different departments, different job titles, different hiring managers. Yet every application traced back to one common source. Margaret Whitmore. My stomach tightened. There has to be an explanation. Daniel nodded. There usually is. Then he slid another page toward me. Every one of those 36 employees had received promotions far faster than the company average. Some had access to confidential financial records. Others worked in payroll, procurement, human resources, legal, information technology. Separately, none of it looked suspicious. Together, it looked like someone had quietly built an internal network. Dad leaned back in his chair. I never questioned her. His voice cracked. I trusted her. For the first time in my life, my father looked heartbroken. Not because of money, because someone had abused his kindness. Daniel wasn't finished. He opened another folder. Over the last 4 years, 23 experienced employees resigned unexpectedly. They were replaced almost immediately. Guess who recommended most of the replacements? I didn't answer. I already knew. Margaret. The pattern was terrifying. Whenever a loyal employee retired, Margaret had someone ready. Whenever a manager resigned, she already knew the perfect candidate. Whenever a new office opened, her recommendations filled key positions. Nobody noticed because it happened slowly. One person, then another, like drops of water wearing away stone. Dad rubbed his forehead. I thought she was helping. So did I whispered. Daniel looked directly at me. There's something else. He handed me several security logs. They showed dozens of after-hours visits to the executive floor. Most belonged to employees connected to Margaret. Some visits lasted only minutes. Others lasted several hours. No official reason had ever been recorded. My heartbeat quickened. They were accessing executive offices? Not necessarily, Daniel replied. But they were inside the building. Late. Very late. We immediately contacted the IT department. Not the regular manager. Someone Daniel personally trusted. Within hours, we discovered dozens of unusual file transfers. Nothing illegal. Nothing obvious. Just tiny pieces of information copied over several years. Supplier contracts. Salary reports. Executive calendars. Future expansion plans. Nothing individually valuable. Combined, it revealed almost everything about Carter Industrial Systems. Someone had been collecting pieces of a puzzle. Dad stood and looked out his office window. I feel like an idiot. I had never heard him speak that way. I walked over. You gave people chances. He shook his head. No, I gave the wrong people access. That afternoon, I watched Margaret walking through the factory. Employees smiled. She hugged workers. She handed cookies to the maintenance crew. She looked exactly like the caring woman everyone adored. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I'd never suspect her. That's what frightened me the most. That evening, Olivia asked if I wanted dinner. I already ate. She frowned. You've barely spoken to me all day? I've just been busy. She walked closer. Is something wrong at work? For a split second, I almost told her everything. Then I remembered Daniel's warning. Trust no one until we know who is involved. I forced a smile. Just quarterly reports. She seemed relieved. Too relieved. Later that night, after Olivia fell asleep, I quietly picked up her phone from the bedside table. I had never invaded her privacy before. I hated myself for doing it. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. The phone was locked. I already knew her passcode. Our wedding anniversary, as soon as it opened. My heart sank. There were hundreds of deleted messages. Recently erased. Almost every conversation with Margaret had been wiped clean. Who deletes years of messages with their own mother? Unless they don't want anyone else reading them. I restored a backup from the cloud. Most conversations returned. My hands began to shake. The messages weren't about birthdays or family dinners. They were about my father's company. One text read, Employee 14 has been promoted. Another said, Richard still trusts me completely. Then another, don't let Ethan see the board proposal. I couldn't breathe. Employee 14? Why were people being numbered? Who talked like that? Then I found a message dated 3 weeks earlier. Margaret had written, We're almost ready. Once the ownership changes, everything falls into place. Olivia replied with only 4 words. He suspects nothing yet. I stared at the screen. Again, 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 praying I had misunderstood. But the words never changed. Tears filled my eyes. The woman I loved, the woman I had promised forever, had been lying to me for years. I quietly placed the phone back on the nightstand. Then I walked downstairs. I sat alone in the dark kitchen until sunrise. Not because I was angry, because my heart was breaking. I kept asking myself one question. Was any of our marriage real? Or had I simply been another part of Margaret's plan? The sun came up, but I never went to bed. I sat in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, staring at nothing. Upstairs, Olivia was still asleep. Or maybe she wasn't. Maybe she'd noticed I'd been gone all night. Maybe she didn't care. For 5 years, I had believed we shared every dream, every fear, every plan for the future. Now I couldn't stop wondering if every kiss, every I love you, every anniversary celebration had been part of a carefully written script. At 7:30, Olivia walked downstairs wearing one of my old college sweatshirts. She smiled. There you are. You disappeared. I forced myself to look at her. I couldn't sleep. She poured herself coffee and kissed my cheek. You've been working too hard. Her voice was gentle, comforting. The same voice that had helped me through my mother's surgery. The same voice that had whispered wedding vows. Yet now, every word sounded rehearsed. At the office, Dad was already waiting. Daniel Brooks had spent the entire night investigating the 36 employees. His face told me the news wasn't good. They're connected, he said. Every single one. He projected a diagram onto the conference room wall. It looked like a spider's web. Each employee connected to another through former jobs, relatives, business partnerships, or mutual financial accounts. Most of the connections had been hidden during the hiring process. No single manager could have seen the entire picture. But together, it revealed something terrifying. This wasn't coincidence. It was organization. Daniel pointed to one name. Susan Keller. She worked in payroll. Another name. Michael Reeves. Information technology. Then another. Linda Chavez. Legal department. One by one. The names covered nearly every critical division of Carter Industrial Systems. They weren't just employees. They occupied positions where information flowed, where decisions were made, where influence mattered. Dad slowly sat down. My God, they've surrounded us. Before anyone could speak again, the conference room door opened. Margaret walked in carrying a tray of fresh muffins. She smiled warmly. I thought you boys skipped breakfast again. For a split second, nobody moved. She had no idea we knew. Dad looked at the woman he'd treated like family for years. His voice almost broke. Thank you, Margaret. She placed the tray on the table. Richard, don't work too hard. Then she looked at me. Ethan, Olivia said you've been stressed lately. You should take a vacation. I forced a smile. Maybe I will. She laughed softly. Family always comes first. Those words hit me like a knife. Family? That was exactly what she'd used against us. The moment she left, Daniel whispered, She's incredibly confident. Dad nodded. Because she doesn't think we've noticed. Let's keep it that way. For the next week, we acted as though nothing had changed. Dad continued greeting employees every morning. I attended meetings as usual. Margaret organized a charity luncheon. Everything looked perfectly normal. Behind the scenes, Daniel and his team quietly copied emails, financial records, and security footage. They interviewed former employees who had resigned years earlier. A pattern emerged. Several admitted they'd felt pressured to leave. One manager recalled being excluded from meetings after questioning one of Margaret's recommendations. Another remembered confidential files disappearing from his office. None of it had made sense then. Now it did. One afternoon, an elderly maintenance supervisor named Frank asked if he could speak with me privately. Frank had worked for Dad for 32 years. He'd watched me grow up. He closed my office door. "Ethan, I've been waiting years for someone to ask questions." He handed me a small notebook. I wrote things down. Inside were dates, names, unusual conversations, people meeting after hours, employees transferring departments without explanation. At the bottom of one page, Frank had written a sentence that made my blood run cold. "Margaret says loyalty belongs to the future owner." Future owner? What future owner? That evening, I confronted Olivia. Not with accusations, just questions. "Did you ever ask your mother to recommend employees?" She looked surprised. "Of course. She knew talented people." "Why?" "Just wondering." She smiled nervously. "That's a strange question." I nodded. "Yeah, it is." Neither of us believed the conversation was innocent. 3 days later, everything changed. Dad called an emergency board meeting. Not to expose anyone. To announce a temporary freeze on promotions and executive hiring. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, 6 of Margaret's closest employees exchanged dozens of emails. IT intercepted them. One message read, "Something's wrong." Another, "Move up the timeline." And finally, "Tell Margaret." Daniel looked at Dad. "They know." That night, I returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet. Olivia's car wasn't in the driveway. I checked the family location app. She wasn't at the gym like she'd told me. She was downtown, at a private office building. I drove there without thinking. From across the street, I watched her walk inside. 5 minutes later, Margaret arrived. Then 2 men I recognized from our company's procurement department. They entered together. No smiles. No hugs. Just business. I waited nearly 2 hours. When they finally came out, Olivia handed Margaret a thick envelope. Margaret tucked it into her purse. I felt something inside me finally break. Not explode. Not shatter. Just quietly die. The next morning, I met with a divorce attorney. Saying the words aloud felt unreal. "I want to file for divorce." The attorney looked at me carefully. "Are you certain?" I thought about our wedding day, the promises, the dreams, the life we'd planned. Then I remembered the text message. "He suspects nothing yet." I nodded. "Yes, I'm certain." I didn't tell Olivia immediately. Instead, I focused on protecting Dad's company. Because for the first time, I understood something important. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about saving hundreds of honest employees whose livelihoods depended on Carter, industrial systems surviving. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even the woman I loved, destroy everything my father had spent 40 years building. But none of us realized the biggest betrayal was still waiting to be uncovered. Filing for divorce wasn't the hardest part. Walking back into the house that evening and pretending everything was normal, that nearly broke me. Olivia greeted me with a warm smile. "I made your favorite dinner," she said. Grilled steak, garlic mashed potatoes, fresh baked rolls. 5 years earlier, I would have wrapped my arms around her and thanked her. Now I couldn't stop wondering if she was trying to comfort me or distract me. We ate almost the entire meal in silence. Finally, she looked at me. "Ethan, are we okay?" I took a deep breath. "No." Her smile disappeared. "What do you mean?" I looked directly into her eyes. "I've hired a divorce attorney." The fork slipped from her hand and hit the plate with a loud clang. For several seconds, she simply stared at me. Then tears filled her eyes. "A divorce? Why? What did I do?" Her voice sounded so sincere that for one painful moment, I almost doubted everything I'd discovered. Then I remembered the messages. "He suspects nothing yet." I quietly stood up. "You know exactly why." She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. "No," I said softly. "Not this time." The next morning, Margaret stormed into my office without knocking. She slammed the door behind her. "What have you done to my daughter?" Her face was red with anger. "I filed for divorce." "Why?" I remained calm. "Our marriage is over." "That's not an answer." She stepped closer. "You made vows before God. You don't walk away because of a rough season." I looked at her. It's much more than a rough season. For the first time since I'd known her, Margaret's confident smile disappeared. She searched my face as if trying to determine how much I knew. Finally, she asked one question. Has your father said anything? That single sentence told me everything. She wasn't worried about Olivia. She was worried about Dad. I answered carefully. No. She nodded slowly, then forced another smile. I hope you two work this out. She walked away. But I noticed something. Her hands were shaking. That afternoon, Daniel entered my office carrying another stack of files. We found offshore accounts. My heart skipped. What? 3 shell companies, all connected through layers of corporations. Guess who appears at the center? He didn't need to tell me. Margaret. The accounts had received millions of dollars over several years. The money hadn't come directly from Carter Industrial Systems. Instead, it flowed through inflated vendor contracts, consulting agreements, and fake service fees, small amounts. Just enough to avoid attracting attention. Over time, those small amounts became nearly $18 million. Dad slowly sat down. 18 million. Daniel nodded. And that's only what we've found. The board of directors met that evening. For security reasons, only 6 people attended. Phones stayed outside. Curtains remained closed. Daniel explained everything. The hidden hiring network, the financial transfers, the shell companies, the suspicious meetings. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one elderly board member whispered, I've known Margaret for 6 years. I would have trusted her with my grandchildren. Dad looked around the room. So would I. Meanwhile, Margaret was making her own moves. One by one, the 36 employees began requesting emergency meetings. Several suddenly called in sick. Others copied confidential files. A few quietly emptied their desks. They knew something was happening. The network was beginning to panic. Late Friday afternoon, Frank, the maintenance supervisor, rushed into my office. Ethan, you need to come now. We hurried to the old warehouse. Inside, 2 employees were loading boxes into a delivery van. When they saw us, they froze. Frank opened one of the boxes. Inside were thousands of company documents, personnel records, supplier contracts, patent designs, financial reports, everything ready to disappear. The men claimed they were moving archives. No one believed them. Security escorted them off the property. Within an hour, both resigned. That evening, Olivia came to the house to collect some of her belongings. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying. I still love you, she whispered. I believed she meant it. Maybe she did love me. But love without honesty becomes something else. Something fragile. Something dangerous. She handed me her wedding ring. I never wanted this. I looked at the ring resting in my palm. Neither had I. I hope someday you tell me the whole truth. A tear rolled down her cheek. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Without another word, she walked away. I never stopped her. 2 days later, Daniel called before sunrise. We've got a problem. One of Margaret's closest employees had disappeared overnight. His office was empty. His computer had been wiped clean. His company phone was gone. So was his family. They had vanished. Dad immediately contacted federal investigators. This had become far bigger than an internal company issue. By Monday morning, investigators arrived with warrants. Quietly, professionally, no flashing lights, no television cameras. They interviewed employees one by one. Most were confused. Some were frightened. A few looked terrified. Margaret continued smiling as though nothing unusual was happening. She greeted investigators politely, offered them coffee, even joked with the receptionist. Watching her remain so calm was unsettling. She acted like someone who still believed she couldn't lose. That confidence lasted exactly 3 more hours. At 2:17 p.m., Daniel walked into the executive conference room carrying one final folder. He placed it in front of Dad. Inside was a document none of us had expected to find. It wasn't a payroll record or a financial statement. It was a handwritten agreement signed years before my wedding. At the bottom of the page, there were 2 signatures. One belonged to Margaret Whitmore. The other made my blood run cold. It belonged to someone in my own family, someone I had trusted my entire life, someone who had been helping her from the very beginning. For several long seconds, no one in the conference room spoke. Dad stared at the signature as though his eyes refused to believe what they were seeing. I reached for the document with trembling hands. The first signature belonged to Margaret Whitmore. The second belonged to my cousin, Nathan Carter, my uncle's only son, the boy who had practically grown up with me. Nathan and I were born only 8 months apart. Every Thanksgiving, we played football in Grandma's backyard. Every Christmas, we opened presents together. When we were teenagers, we worked side by side in Dad's warehouse during summer breaks. I stood beside him at his wedding. He stood beside me at mine. If someone had asked me to name the last person who would betray our family, Nathan would have been at the bottom of the list. Dad slowly lowered his head. I trusted him like a son. So had I. Daniel pointed to the agreement. It was signed nearly 7 years ago, 2 years before my wedding. The document outlined a long-term strategy, not to destroy Carter Industrial Systems, but to control it from the inside. Margaret would place trusted people throughout the company. Nathan would provide internal information about the Carter family. Together, they would slowly gain influence until ownership could be shifted during a future leadership transition, Dad whispered. They planned this before Ethan even met Olivia. The room fell silent. That meant my relationship, my marriage, had never been outside Margaret's plan, whether Olivia loved me or not. She had entered my life after the strategy had already begun. The realization left me feeling hollow. Nathan was called into the office immediately. He arrived 20 minutes later, smiling as if nothing were wrong. What's going on? Dad slid the agreement across the table. Nathan looked at it. His smile disappeared. He didn't deny it. He didn't even pretend. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. I guess you finally figured it out. Those words hit harder than any confession. Dad's voice shook with disappointment. Why? Nathan looked down at the table. Because I spent my whole life watching everyone praise you. Richard Carter, the self-made businessman, the perfect father, the generous boss. He looked directly at Dad. Nobody ever noticed the rest of us. Dad stared at him in disbelief. You could have come to me. I would have helped you. Nathan laughed bitterly. I didn't want help. I wanted what you had. He admitted that Margaret approached him years earlier. She promised him something he had secretly wanted his entire life. Power. She convinced him that when Dad retired, the company should belong to a new generation. Nathan believed he deserved to lead, even though he'd never built anything himself. Margaret fed that resentment until it became ambition. Then ambition became greed. As investigators questioned Nathan, another surprise emerged. He wasn't the mastermind. He was simply Margaret's bridge into the Carter family. The real architect had always been Margaret. Every hiring decision, every promotion, every carefully placed employee, every delayed contract, every supplier change, every tiny decision had been moving toward one goal. Control, not overnight, slowly, patiently, silently. That afternoon, federal investigators interviewed Olivia. She arrived looking exhausted. She hadn't slept. Neither had I. Through the conference room window, I watched her answer questions for nearly 3 hours. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she sat in complete silence. Finally, Daniel entered my office. She cooperated. I looked up. Did she know? He hesitated. Not everything. According to investigators, Olivia had grown up believing her mother's actions were meant to protect the Carter family's future. Margaret convinced her that Dad's company would someday belong to Ethan anyway. She claimed placing trusted employees inside the business was simply safeguarding that future. Olivia admitted she'd never questioned her mother's explanations. She trusted her, just as I had. But over time, Margaret stopped telling her everything. She shared only enough to keep her loyal. When Olivia finally realized how far the plan had gone, she was already trapped. That evening, she asked to see me. We met in a quiet park where we'd shared our first date years earlier. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, she broke the silence. I loved you. The words came through tears. I still do. I believed her. But believing her didn't erase the years of deception. She reached into her purse and handed me a small flash drive. I found this hidden in my mother's safe. It's everything. Emails, financial records, private notes, names, passwords, meeting schedules, everything Margaret had spent years hiding. Olivia had risked everything by bringing it to me. I should have stopped her years ago, she whispered. I was too afraid. I looked at the woman I had once imagined growing old with. For the first time since filing for divorce, I saw not a conspirator, but a daughter who had spent her entire life under the control of a manipulative mother. I quietly said, I forgive you. She covered her face and began crying. But forgiveness, I continued softly, doesn't always repair what's broken. She nodded. I know. The flash drive changed everything. Investigators uncovered hundreds of encrypted files, hidden bank transfers, recorded conversations, contracts signed under false company names. The evidence stretched back almost a decade. It was far larger than anyone imagined. By sunrise, warrants were issued for several members of the network. Phones began ringing across the city. One after another, Margaret's carefully built empire started collapsing. Employees who had once acted fearless now began cooperating with investigators. Some confessed. Others turned over documents. A few admitted they'd never realized the full extent of the scheme. They simply followed instructions from people they trusted. At 8:15 the next morning, federal agents arrived at Carter Industrial Systems with one final warrant. This time, they weren't looking for files. They were looking for Margaret Whitmore herself. But when they entered her office, it was empty. Her computer was gone. Her desk had been cleared. And taped neatly to the center of her desk was a single handwritten note. It contained only one sentence. You may have won the company, but you'll never find me. Margaret Whitmore had vanished. By the time federal agents searched her office, every drawer had been emptied. Her laptop was gone. Her company phone had been destroyed. Even the framed family photos that had decorated her shelves had disappeared. She had planned her escape. Dad sat quietly in the boardroom, staring at the empty chair where Margaret had attended executive meetings for years. I invited her into this family, he whispered, and she spent every day looking for a way to destroy it. No one knew what to say. Within hours, news of the investigation spread throughout the company. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering in hallways and cafeterias. Many couldn't believe the woman they called Mama Margaret was at the center of the scandal. Others cried. Some felt guilty for introducing friends she had recommended. The company wasn't just dealing with financial damage. It was dealing with heartbreak. Trust had been shattered. Dad refused to hide. Instead of staying in his office, he walked onto the factory floor. Hundreds of employees stopped working as he climbed onto a loading platform. For nearly a minute, he simply looked at them. Some had worked beside him for 30 years. Others had joined only months before. My friends, he began. His voice was calm but heavy. I owe every one of you the truth. He told them about the investigation. He admitted that someone he trusted had betrayed the company. Then he surprised everyone. This failure belongs to me. The crowd fell silent. I believed that kindness alone was enough to protect this company. I was wrong. But I promise you this. Carter Industrial Systems will survive, and every honest employee will have a future here. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Not because the crisis was over, but because they knew their leader wasn't hiding behind excuses. Meanwhile, investigators were closing in. The flash drive Olivia had handed over contained something Margaret never expected anyone to find. Travel records, private flight reservations, hotel bookings made under false names. One destination appeared 3 different times. A quiet coastal town in South Carolina. Daniel smiled for the first time in days. I think we know where she's going. Federal agents moved quickly. But Margaret was always one step ahead. By the time they searched the beach house she had rented, she was already gone. Inside, however, investigators found several locked boxes. The contents shocked everyone. Cash, fake passports, multiple driver's licenses, bank documents from overseas. and dozens of handwritten journals. Margaret had documented nearly every stage of her 10-year plan. She believed she would never be caught. Back in Oklahoma, Olivia moved into a small apartment across town. She refused every offer of financial help from her mother. She also declined interviews from reporters. Instead, she volunteered at a local community kitchen 6 days a week. One afternoon, I stopped by unexpectedly. She was serving meals to elderly veterans. She looked thinner, tired, but peaceful. She smiled when she saw me. I guess this is my way of trying to become someone better. I nodded. You don't have to prove anything to me. She looked down. I know. I have to prove it to myself. Weeks passed. One by one, the 36 employees faced investigators. Some admitted they had accepted promotions in exchange for loyalty. Others confessed they had hidden documents or shared confidential information. A surprising number said they had no idea. Margaret's ultimate goal was to seize control of the company. They had simply trusted her, just as we had. Nathan accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for cooperating fully, he agreed to testify against Margaret and return every dollar he had received. One rainy afternoon, he asked to see Dad. I stayed in the room. Nathan couldn't stop crying. I'm sorry, Uncle Richard. I traded my family for money. Dad looked at him for a long time, then quietly replied, No, you traded your character. Money was just the excuse. Nathan lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. Months later, Carter Industrial Systems began to heal. New leadership was appointed. Independent auditors reviewed every department. Hiring procedures were completely rewritten. No single executive could ever again influence recruitment the way Margaret had. Frank, the maintenance supervisor who had kept years of careful notes, received the company's highest honor for integrity. When Dad handed him the award, the entire factory stood and applauded. Frank smiled through tears. I only did what every employee should do. Protect the place that feeds our families. Just when it seemed the nightmare was ending, Daniel called me late one evening. They found her. My heart raced. Where? A small cabin near the Canadian border. She didn't resist. The next morning, I watched the news. Margaret was led from the cabin in handcuffs. She showed no emotion, no fear, no regret. She looked directly into a reporter's camera and said only one sentence. I did what was necessary. The trial began 4 months later. The courtroom was packed. Former employees, reporters, board members, even competitors. Everyone wanted to hear Margaret explain herself. When asked why she had spent 10 years manipulating an innocent family, she stood calmly and answered, The world belongs to people willing to take it. There wasn't a trace of remorse in her voice. The jury watched in stunned silence. But then, the prosecution introduced one final witness. A witness Margaret never expected. Someone whose testimony would destroy the last piece of her defense. Her own daughter, Olivia. The courtroom was so quiet that even the sound of footsteps echoed across the room. Every seat was filled. Employees from Carter Industrial Systems, members of the press, business leaders from across the state. Even people who had never met our family wanted to witness the trial that had dominated headlines for months. Then the courtroom doors opened. Olivia walked in. She wore a simple navy blue suit with no jewelry except the small silver cross her grandmother had given her as a child. She looked nothing like the confident woman I had married. She looked tired, older, as if carrying years of regret on her shoulders. Margaret watched her daughter approach the witness stand without showing a single emotion. After taking the oath, Olivia sat down. The prosecutor spoke gently. Ms. Whitmore, why have you agreed to testify today? Olivia swallowed hard. Because the truth matters more than protecting my last name. The courtroom became silent. She looked toward Dad. I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. You welcomed me into your family. You treated me like your own daughter. And I failed you. Dad simply nodded. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He was listening. For the next 3 hours, Olivia told the jury everything she knew. She explained how Margaret had always believed that powerful families were never given opportunities. They took them. When Olivia was a teenager, her mother often told her, "Kind people build companies. Smart people own them." At the time, she thought it was only a strange saying. She never imagined Margaret was already planning to live by it. Olivia admitted that years before I met her, Margaret had begun building relationships with people connected to Carter industrial systems. She attended charity events, business dinners, community fundraisers. She learned everyone's names, their habits, their weaknesses, their ambitions. She wasn't making friends. She was gathering information. Then came the hardest question. The prosecutor looked directly at Olivia. "When you met Ethan Carter, did your mother encourage the relationship?" Tears immediately filled Olivia's eyes. She looked at me for only a second before answering. "Yes," the courtroom gasped. "My mother believed marrying into the Carter family would give her permanent access." The words hurt. Even though I'd suspected them for months, hearing them spoken aloud felt different. It felt final. "But," Olivia continued, "something happened that my mother never expected." The prosecutor waited. "I fell in love with Ethan." She began crying. "Our marriage started because of my mother's plan. But my love for him became real." She wiped away tears. "I wanted to leave everything behind. I begged my mother to stop." She refused. Margaret finally reacted. For the first time during the trial, she stood up. "She's lying!" The judge immediately ordered her to sit down. Margaret glared at Olivia with a look I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was betrayal. The manipulator had been betrayed by the one person she believed she completely controlled. The prosecutor introduced the journals recovered from Margaret's cabin. One page contained a chilling sentence written years earlier. "Once Ethan marries Olivia, the final phase begins." Another entry listed the 36 employees by number, not by name, just numbers. To Margaret, people weren't human beings. They were pieces on a chessboard. Then came the final piece of evidence. Daniel Brooks took the stand. He displayed a timeline covering 10 years. Every promotion, every hire, every financial transfer, every secret meeting, every decision fit together perfectly. The jury watched in stunned silence. The defense had no explanation. There wasn't one. After a 6-week trial, the jury returned. No one moved as the foreperson stood. "We find the defendant guilty." One count after another echoed through the courtroom. Corporate fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, identity fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice. Margaret showed no emotion. Not until the judge announced her sentence. She would spend decades in federal prison. Only then did her shoulders finally slump. For the first time, she looked defeated. As officers escorted her away, she turned toward Olivia. "I did everything for you." Olivia quietly shook her head. "No, you did everything for yourself." Those were the last words they ever spoke to each other. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded our family. Microphones stretched in every direction. Cameras flashed nonstop. Dad stepped forward. He didn't talk about the verdict. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he said, "This case was never about revenge. It was about protecting honest people. Thousands of families depend on our company. They deserve leaders who earn trust instead of stealing it." His words appeared on television stations across the country. Employees later told us they had never been prouder to work for Carter Industrial Systems. A month later, Dad invited every employee to the company's annual appreciation banquet. For the first time in years, there were no secret agendas, no hidden loyalties, only honest people rebuilding together. Dad surprised everyone by announcing a new scholarship program for employees' children. He also created the Frank Harrison Integrity Award, named after the maintenance supervisor whose courage had helped expose the truth. When Frank walked onto the stage, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The applause lasted nearly 5 minutes. Frank wiped away tears and smiled. "I wasn't brave. I was simply loyal." As the evening ended, I stepped outside for some fresh air. Someone quietly walked up beside me. It was Olivia. She had received permission to attend as a guest. Not as family, not anymore. She smiled sadly. "I'm leaving tomorrow." "Where are you going?" "Oregon. I've accepted a job with a nonprofit that helps children whose parents are in prison. I nodded. I think you'll do a lot of good. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I don't expect another chance. I just hope someday, when you remember me, you'll remember that at least some of our life together was real. I looked up at the stars before answering. I already know it was. For the first time in many months, we smiled at each other. Not as husband and wife, but as two people finally free from the shadow of someone else's choices. 1 year later, the scars were still there. Some wounds never completely disappear. They simply stop hurting every morning. As I drove through the front gates of Carter Industrial Systems, I noticed something different. Employees were smiling again. The parking lot was full. The factory whistles echoed across the buildings just as they had when I was a little boy. For the first time in years, the company felt like home again. Dad was already walking through the production floor with his old lunchbox tucked under his arm. Some habits never changed. He stopped to shake hands with welders, mechanics, and office staff just like he had every morning for 40 years. The difference was, now everyone understood why. Leadership wasn't about titles. It was about showing up every single day. After the scandal, Carter Industrial Systems introduced one of the strictest ethics programs in the industry. Every executive, including me, was required to complete annual ethics training. Hiring decisions could no longer be influenced by a single person. Independent committees reviewed every promotion. Anonymous reporting systems protected employees who spoke up. Trust had been broken. Now it had to be earned. The 36 positions once controlled by Margaret's network had been filled by honest professionals. Many were former employees who had left years earlier because something hadn't felt right. When they returned, they weren't just coming back to a company. They were coming home. Frank Harrison officially retired that spring. The company renamed the Employee Training Center in his honor. A bronze plaque at the entrance read, "Integrity is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, Frank Harrison." Years later, Dad quietly visited him. When I asked why, Dad smiled sadly. Holding on to anger only gives betrayal another victory. That was my father. Strong enough to forgive. Wise enough never to forget. As for Olivia, she kept her promise. The nonprofit in Oregon grew into one of the state's most respected organizations for children whose parents were incarcerated. She never remarried. She dedicated her life to helping children avoid the mistakes made by the adults around them. Occasionally, we'd exchange short emails. Always respectful. Always kind. No bitterness. No false hope. Just gratitude for the good moments we had shared. Some relationships aren't meant to last forever, but they can still change your life forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, Dad asked me to join him in the original garage where Carter Industrial Systems had begun. The tiny building had been preserved as a company museum. The old welding machine still stood in the corner. The concrete floor still bore burn marks from decades earlier. Dad ran his hand across the workbench. This place built everything. Then he looked at me. I used to think success meant building a great company. He smiled. I was wrong. What does it mean now? I asked. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Building people. The company can be stolen. Money can disappear. Buildings can burn. But if you build people with honesty, kindness, and courage, no one can ever take that away. Those words became the guiding principle of my life. 5 years later, Dad officially retired. At the retirement ceremony, more than 2,000 employees, retirees, suppliers, and community members filled the factory grounds. Instead of giving a long speech, Dad simply handed me the old steel lunchbox he'd carried for decades. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "Never let success make you forget the people who helped you earn it. Protect them, and the company will protect itself." I couldn't hold back my tears. Neither could he. The crowd stood and applauded for several minutes. Not for the businessman, but for the man. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I walked through the quiet factory alone. The machines were silent. The lights reflected off polished concrete floors. I paused beside a framed photograph hanging in the hallway. It showed Dad standing in front of the tiny garage with nothing but a welding helmet and a dream. Next to it hung a newer photograph. Hundreds of employees standing together after the company recovered. Different generations, different backgrounds. One family. I finally understood something. Margaret had spent 10 years trying to steal a company. But she failed because she never understood what truly made it valuable. It wasn't the buildings. It wasn't the machines. It wasn't the money. It was the people. And people united by trust are stronger than any conspiracy. If this story touched your heart, remember that trust is one of life's greatest gifts. But wisdom teaches us to protect it without losing our kindness. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next emotional story. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you had discovered a betrayal like Ethan's? Until next time, take care of yourself. Cherish the people who earn your trust, and never stop believing that truth has a way of finding the light. The end. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue creating heartfelt stories that inspire hope, healing, and lasting love. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next story.